Yeah. Code Veronica is the true Resident Evil 3. But let me make it perfectly clear before half of you turn on me like an angry village full of ganados. That doesn't mean Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is a bad game or even necessarily worse. I just believe that Veronica is more deserving of that coveted number 3 title. Don't agree? Well, allow me to change your mind as I go through its development history and the significant advancements Code Veronica brought to the Resident Evil series as a whole. See, initially, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was developed as a spin-off, while Code Veronica was given the resources to be a main entry to the series. But despite this main entry status, Resident Evil Code Veronica was never actually developed with the intention of having that coveted number title, Resident Evil 3. Bummer. Would have really made my argument easier. You see, for Capcom, the reason behind not numbering Code Veronica was simply that they wanted to consistently keep the numeric titles on PlayStation. Because of this, a lot of people believe that Sony had some sort of exclusivity deal with Capcom, forcing them to reserve the 3 title for their console. But after some digging, there's no actual evidence of this deal to confirm this to be the case. So if numbered titles were reserved for PlayStation and Nemesis was on the PlayStation, that means Nemesis was always supposed to be 3, right? Wrong. Nemesis was originally intended to be nothing more than a little side story with the working title Biohazard 1.9 and 2.1. And for the record, Resident Evil is called Biohazard in Japan. You already knew that. So a new fresh-faced young staff took the reins and was given a restricted budget to create the spin-off. They were led by new writer Yasuhisa Kawamura and director Kazuhiro Aoyama, a level designer from the first 2 titles. Meanwhile, Hideki Kamiya was set to make the real Resident Evil 3 for PlayStation in the near future, thus completing a trilogy on the system. However, a modest upcoming console known as the PlayStation 2 decided to exist and ruin everything. Development for the Kamiya-helmed Resident Evil 3 was shipped on over to the more powerful, potentially more popular new console. So now there's this void. Capcom was really hoping for a trilogy on PlayStation 1, so what's a game company to do? Well, gee, they still have this nifty 1.9 spin-off they're working on, why not just promote that to 3? Producer Shinji Mikami was allegedly against the idea, calling that move misleading and a lie to the fans. But then general manager of development Yoshiki Okamoto was like, you'll make more money. Huh. And so they argued for allegedly 3 whole days before Shinji Mikami begrudgingly gave in. I like to imagine them like locked in a room for that whole duration. So the spin-off game was given the title Biohazard 3 Last Escape and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. They frantically added staff to flesh out what they had as much as possible. And just like that, Capcom sold their principles out to just make a quick buck. My argument is that they should have shown some restraint. One option would have been to wait for Hideki Kamiya's game to be released on the PlayStation 2. That would have been a terrible idea, because that game ended up becoming Devil May Cry, but that's a whole story for another day. I'm just saying, they didn't have to force the number 3 onto the sweet, overwhelmed spin-off to keep that shallow dream of a PlayStation 1 trilogy alive. Instead, they could have simply thrown it onto the main game already announced and in development, Code Veronica. See, Code Veronica was made as a bit of an apology to Sega fans for botching a Resident Evil 2 port on the Sega Saturn, but it's like the nicest, greatest apology ever. A brand new main series title for their new console, the Dreamcast. Code Veronica was directed by Hiroki Kato and given a staff of about 70 spread over several companies. Compared to Nemesis's initial staff of about 20 that eventually had to be doubled, it's clear how Capcom first viewed the 2 games as priorities within the series. Code Veronica was simply a bigger project. Sure, it was never actually intended to be the 3rd title, but when compared to the development history of the other options, a low-budget spin-off and Devil May Cry, I'd say it should have been. Development history aside, the story of Code Veronica advances the narrative of the Resident Evil franchise far more than Nemesis does. First of all, Resident Evil 2 upped the ante from Resident Evil 1. You know, you went from a quaint little mansion incident to an entire city outbreak, from only dozens of potential zombies to thousands. And the new G-Virus added a whole new layer to the story. With Resident Evil 2, the stakes were higher than ever, and we saw the widening influence of Umbrella's hard experiments. So how should Resident Evil 3 further the story? What's next after Racoon City? Well, Nemesis decides to halt this progress and simply stay in that city, filling in a few gaps that Resident Evil 2 left open. I mean, sure, the Raccoon City outbreak deserved to be fleshed out, but calling it a full sequel seems like a bit much. Nemesis basically told the story of Jill Valentine from Resident Evil 1's Last Escape. See, Last Escape is the Japanese subtitle. She fights her way through Raccoon City, including a limited police station recycled from Resident Evil 2. Along the way, she works with Umbrella mercenaries and escapes the clutches of the stalking Nemesis tyrant. I like Jill, and it's cool to see her perspective of the outbreak. remake, but compared to the first two entries, Nemesis has a very stripped-down, bare-bones story. Hell, it takes place so close to RE2 that it was originally called 1.9 and 2.1. Code Veronica, on the other hand, created a whole new experience. A few months after RE2, Claire continues her search for her brother Chris by infiltrating a Parisian umbrella base. Whoa, slow down, girl. She's captured and taken to Rockford Island in the South Pacific, where she learns all about the sadistic Ashford family and the creation of the horrific T. Veronica virus. Let me tell you, the backstory of the Ashford twins is rich. Like, Alfred has a split personality and he's pretending to be Alexia, and the two twins are kind of like into each other. It's a lot more complex than anything Nemesis has to offer. And hey, just like how Resident Evil 2 introduces a new virus, so does Code Veronica. And our old friend Albert Wesker is after this new T. Veronica virus and must be stopped before he can use it for his nefarious purposes. Chris Redfield eventually has to step in and save the day, and he and Claire find themselves caught up in this winding tale. Their struggle against Wesker and the Ashford family leads them to Antarctica. So with Code Veronica, we have a sweeping global story taking place across 3 continents. Convoluted? Perhaps, but hey, this is Resident Evil we're talking about. Compared to Nemesis, Code Veronica's story has a much grander scale. And in hindsight, the way it affected the future Resident Evil timeline really is what makes it more deserving of the title 3. Spoilers ahoy. Resident Evil 3 has arguably only 2 really significant developments for the series. First, Racoon City's nuclear destruction. And admittedly, this is a big revelation, but really it just supplements the already tragic fate of the city's zombification from 2. It's like an explosive epilogue to a story we already know. Second, Nemesis explains the fate of Jill so that her story can be continued in future titles. Unfortunately, as time went on, Jill was pushed to the side by Capcom, really only showing up in a main series, non-spin-off title through Resident Evil 5. And even there, she was mostly a pawn controlled by Wesker. And I'm sorry, I love Revelations, I do, but they're spin-offs. So in the grand scheme of Resident Evil, the continuation of her story proved not to be too significant. Capcom may have benched Jill in a lot of ways, but Chris Redfield, a Code Veronica protagonist, is still a major player to this day. Chris has appeared in more main series titles than any other character. 1, Code Veronica, 5, 6, and even 7. I didn't see Jill helicoptering into the bayou. Chris may be the most vital protagonist of the whole Resident Evil series, and his story simply couldn't be told without Code Veronica. Outside of protagonists, Code Veronica's story explains Umbrella's increasing global influence for years to come, and how the threat of viral Armageddon didn't stop at Racoon City, especially with sneaky Weskers afoot. Overall, much bigger step forward than Nemesis's plot. And speaking of Wesker, Code Veronica is the game that created the iconic villain our mind jumps to when we think of Wesker. In Resident Evil 1, Wesker's voice acting and characterization was a little rough around the edges. Remember, Code Veronica came out before Resident Evil Remake, so the cool, suave, dastardly version of Wesker we know today was really introduced in Code Veronica. Not only did he survive in RE1, but he was also imbued with some sick virus-charged super abilities. Wesker is easily the most iconic Resident Evil villain, and it's all thanks to Code Veronica. Come on. You know fleshing out Wesker and Chris alone lifts Code Veronica's significance above Nemesis, but I'm not even done yet. Moving on to gameplay, we all know the controversial trajectory the Resident Evil series took. Cue the explosions and boulder punching. That's right, action galore. And frankly, both titles were comparing greatly ramped up this action, but in different ways. Code Veronica just did it better. For the most part, both games follow the tried and true Resident Evil survival horror formula. They balance inventory management with solving puzzles and strategically choosing when to engage in combat. But in these two titles, the game increases the action by throwing a lot more enemies and hordes of zombies at the player. To compensate, both games try to supply more ammunition. Nemesis introduced gunpowder, allowing players to create different ammo based on the situation, though most players will still struggle with ammo conservation on some playthroughs, myself included. This is especially true when choosing to fight the titular Nemesis for optional gun upgrades. Dude is a bullet sponge, let me tell you. Code Veronica, however, always provided enough ammunition to take down any foe, albeit spread over a variety of weapons. The different weapons made the transition to action smoother than Nemesis. Code Veronica has 15 different weapons and upgrades, 16 if you include the gold Lugers. So combat is an always changing experience, distance while fighting classic zombies and bandersnatches. First-person sniping in a Resident Evil game? Why not? This variety of over-the-top fun weapons would continue to progress throughout the franchise. I mean, just look at the ridiculous arsenal Leon keeps stocked in Resident Evil 4. Not only will you need cash, but you'll need guts to buy that weapon, stranger. I'm kind of hoping you throw in the actual clip instead of using that terrible impression. Nemesis only sported 12 weapons and upgrades, and many of them were locked behind a certain difficulty or only unlockable through the Mercenaries mode. In Code Veronica, only the launcher needed to be unlocked. And the knife. Oh! The knife. Maybe I always had enough ammunition because the knife in Code Veronica is actually useful compared to previous titles. We all remember knifing boxes and downed enemies to save bullets starting in Resident Evil 4, but it's Code Veronica that first upgraded the utility of the old slice and dicer. Nemesis attempted to be more action-oriented by also implementing a dodge feature activated by proper timing of the aim button, but it can be extremely fickle. Nemesis himself could be seen as a serious step forward, but I'm sorry, Nemesis just isn't that original. Think about it, he's a faster, more persistent Mr. X with a rocket launcher. And that's not an insult at all, that's the most terrifying thing I can really think of. But it's tough to give Nemesis points for progression. Now, obviously, Code Veronica looks better than Nemesis in most ways because it's on a newer generation console. But just saying, these games were released within 6 months of one another. With that small of a gap, shouldn't the real Resident Evil 3 be the more polished-looking title on the newest hardware? Okay, that's some low-hanging fruit. So Code Veronica's real visual advances have to do with how the game is seen. The camera. The classic fixed camera perspectives with pre-rendered backgrounds worked really well for Resident Evil in the mid-90s, but this limited perspective was beginning to get stale. With the fully rendered 3D environments and backgrounds of Code Veronica, the camera was now free to slightly move, pivot, or swoop through the environments, creating a more cinematic experience. It's still somewhat fixed, but the swivel cam is a nice change, and it's clear that the series was on its way towards the dynamic camera experience with the behind-the-shoulder and first-person perspectives of future titles. Speaking of first-person perspectives, that started in Code Veronica 2. Yes, it was with tank controls, and yes, it was limited to battle mode, but it all began here. Sorry, Resident Evil 7, you're just not as cool as you think. And that brings us to perhaps the most damning bit of evidence that Code Veronica is the true Resident Evil 3. The length. Nemesis is a short-ass game, there's no way around it. I think anyone with a little Resident Evil experience can run through the title for the first time in about 6 hours. And yes, I know that there are a few choices in the game that lead to slightly different paths and endings, maybe giving another hour of content, but I'm sorry, these choices and changes really pale in comparison to what Resident Evil 2 did over a year earlier. That game had 4 similar but distinct campaigns that each took about the same time as a Nemesis playthrough. I don't think that's excusable for the next big main title, especially compared to Code Veronica. Yes, there's only one campaign in Code Veronica, but it's huge. I'm talking about 12 hours on a first playthrough, about double the length of Nemesis. And the length of the game isn't the only thing that's blown up in Code Veronica. There's a bunch of cutscenes, the environments are more diverse, and the score is more grandiose. Everything is bigger. Admittedly, this bigger, more ridiculous scope means that Code Veronica is when the series first began to jump the shark. I mean, Wesker literally came back with superpowers like Neo from The Matrix. But you know, that just lends credence to the argument that it's the true transitional Resident Evil 3. We all know how ridiculous the series got. And Jill is great, I can't stress that enough. I love Jill, we all love being able to play as her again. But that's peanuts compared to having both Redfield siblings playable in the same game. Come on, everyone. A game with this epic of a scope and level of fan service really deserves that number 3. Whew. So invigorating to get all that off my chest after all these years. Now, please understand that although I think it's a compelling argument, it's just that, an opinion. So let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments. And I still hope Capcom remakes Nemesis. It still definitely deserves an upgrade. Let's hope we get another epic t-shirt reveal soon. And I will concede, Carlos is a way better companion than Steve. I've been your opinionated host, Marcus, signing off for the Leaderboard, your home for video game facts and opinions.